can view Khadijah's talk after. So you've just had your little notice, and hopefully you're okay with recording it, in which case we'll go ahead and just do so. So Michelle, if you want to go to our agenda. So here's our agenda for this afternoon. I will give you, as I said, some highlights, and then we'll move over to our speaker, Khadijah Booth Watkins. So let's get started. So I don't have to tell you all, this has been a year of profound disruption and challenges for the museum, for our society, for families and children. And children, of course, have been uniquely impacted by the pandemic. And this is really what is going to be the focus of our meeting this afternoon, is what children have been going through and how we and others can support children and families to recover from the pandemic. So many of you know from your research that children have fallen behind academically during this past year and a half. Their mental health and physical health have suffered. We know that obesity in childhood has increased during the past year and a half. Social emotional development has been hampered. And basically attendance at school has dropped precipitously. Of course, childcare has been disrupted. I mean, I could go really on and on, but it's not surprising that parents are very worried about their children and how they're going to recover from this very tough year and a half. Next slide, please. So the museum looked pretty empty last winter, and as you can see this very sad picture of how empty we really were. It has been a really tough year for the museum. If you read in the Globe even yesterday, a kind of catalog of how museums have suffered during the pandemic. And I just really wanted to acknowledge the staff at the museum at this point. We had to make a lot of sacrifices, and those were made on the part of the staff. And not only did they have these various challenges they had to deal with, but they just increased in their ingenuity and their ability to solve problems, their creativity, their willingness to work hard, and their can-do spirit. So it's really been tremendous how the museum has survived during the pandemic. But I really want to say here that I credit the staff for this survival. And of course, the board and the many donors who continue to contribute to us during this difficult time. Next slide. So in spite of the closures and all these drastic steps we had to take, we did apply ourselves creatively, as I said, to how we could really help families during the pandemic, and at the same time try to earn some revenue. And I'm going to now highlight some of the specific accomplishments that we were able to make happen during that time. Those of you that know Melissa Higgins, our new VP of Exhibits and Programs, is there in the lower right-hand corner with her orange mask on. Next slide, please. We, during this time, we did experience some firsts. We did some experiments that we had never done before. You can see on the left this picture of the April vacation week, and on the right, the Explore It Camp week. Children obviously were feeling very isolated, and so were families. So we really mobilized to make this happen. It really was complicated to have a camp. We had to go through a number of approvals from the Department of Public Health and the city. But the April vacation camp was the week of April vacation, obviously, and the students were able to completely take over the museum. So you can just imagine the fun that they had. Participating in STEAM activities and games, in creative expression. And this was also the first time the museum staff had interacted with the public in 6 full months. So it really was a spectacular experience, which led to our Explore It Summer Camp, which took place in July. This was 4 weeks. We saw 80 campers overall, and we were really grateful to have quite a bit of sponsorship money so that we were able to have children to the camp on a complete scholarship, which also included meals and transportation. So this was an outstanding experience and very rewarding for our staff and the visitors. Next slide. We also enjoyed the Summer of Play, which went for the whole summer and was just a celebration of getting back to friends, to family, to enjoying playing and learning together. And here you can see a wonderful picture of an experiment that these kids were taking part in. We opened a new exhibit, Fantastic Forts, on the second floor, and we reopened our beloved new exhibit, Play Space, on the second floor as well, to parents with 3 children 3 years older, 3 years and younger. And I do see Connie Counts and perhaps Sonia Kurzweil on this call who made this possible. So thank you to them. Next slide, please. At the same time, we were doing a lot of tremendous grant work. This particular project run by Robin Meisner, our Senior Director of Child Development, with Saki Iwamoto, our Child Life Specialist on staff. We provided really hundreds of kits and resources to families across the city and across the state through this wonderful program called Linking with Libraries, where we worked with librarians, we worked with playgroup leaders. We provided these kits and resources so that people could actually experience the power of play during the pandemic, because of course we know play is instrumental in making sure that children learn and grow and have the brain development and all the skills development that they need. So this was a really great achievement. We created these 2 kits, Tools for Tiny Hands, which was fine motor skill development, and Me, You, and We, which is a social emotional development kit. And we are still distributing these kits and working with many organizations and even the Department of Early Education and Care. Next slide. This was another wonderful program that was led by Saki Iwamoto and other members of the education team, Everyone Explores, which was support for a program that was for kids with special and medical needs and their families. It also is an online program, and there is a new website that actually is available to anyone for free that helps parents with children with special needs be able to explore and enjoy some of the fun activities that we do here at the Children's Museum. Next slide, which brings me to the resurgence of our wonderful program, Morningstar Access, that's supported by Liberty Mutual. This is a time when the museum is very quiet and children with special and medical needs can come to the museum and enjoy the play just like any other child. And it's so rewarding to have these kids come back to the museum. We weren't able to have Morningstar during our closure, but now we are back to our regular schedule and it's just magnificent. So thank you to Saki and her team for doing the wonderful work that she does on Morningstar Access. Next slide. Coming up, virtual museum. So like so many other museums across the country, we pivoted to presenting our programs online during the pandemic. At this stage, we have over 400 online programs cataloged on our website that is accessible to anyone for free. We started a podcast, the Big and Little Podcast, which you can also access on our website, which is Help for Parents, interviews that I am fortunate to be able to do with important civic leaders who have advice and resources to share with us. And you can see all of the different programs that we presented online and continue to now present online. And these were all created in-house by our staff, and some of them were from our other museum partners and other education organizations that we also presented. And over 30,000 families accessed our virtual museum during the pandemic and continue to enjoy it. I did want to mention next the Created By Festival. That's coming up. This was our festival that we did in FY20, and we were able to do this solely online. I'm very, very happy to tell you that in another week or so, we're going to present our Creative By Festival online again, and also in person later on in October. The Creative By Festival is a celebration of all kinds of making, creating, engineering, everything from robotics to electronics, to battle bots and everything else. So thank you to Neil Tembakar, who's created the Created by Festival with the rest of the STEAM and education staff at the museum. So again, this will all be available to you in our annual report, which you'll be able to get on our website, which I can actually put the link into the chat later on in the meeting. Next slide. So I'm really happy to say, I don't want to take too much more time, but that we have bounced back, and we are going to continue to serve children and families in every way we possibly can. And we're very grateful to all those of you who support us that have made this possible. So I wanted to now introduce you to Khadijah Booth Watkins and Deirdre Phillips. Khadijah is the Associate Director of the Clay Center for Young Healthy Minds at Mass General Hospital and Associate Director of the Child and Adolescent Psychiatry Residency Training Program of MGH at McLean Hospital. She specializes in evaluation, diagnosis, and treatment of psychiatric disorders in children, adolescents, and adults. Thank you, Khadijah. Over to you.
Thank you for having me. Okay, so thank you for having me. I'm excited and I'm always happy to shine the light on mental health. This is such an important topic, and especially in the pandemic, we saw how important mental health really is. And so it's fortunate that we were able to talk more openly about mental health and the mental health needs of our kids during this time. So thank you again. So we will just jump right in so that we can make sure we have time for questions at the end. Am I able to control my own slides? Or
Michelle is going to control those for you. So if you just say next slide.
Okay, next. I have no disclosures. And we will, next slide. Next. So we will just jump right into talking about who we are at the Clay Center. The next slide. And our mission here at Clay is to be a practical online resource dedicated to promoting and supporting the mental health, emotional health, and behavioral well-being of our children, teens, and young adults. Next slide. This is particularly important for us because we know that almost half of cases will show itself by the time the kids are 14, and then more than 75% by the time they're 26. And so with that, we want to emphasize, and we find it important to think about how can we prevent and how can we detect early. This is the key to really taking care of our kids. Next slide. And so with that, being an educational vehicle, education can really serve to inform the public. It allows for us to have a dialogue. It dispels myths and misconceptions. And when we think about myths and misconceptions that are out there related to mental health, they're typically grounded in miseducation and misinformation. Also, with education, we can help identify mental illness and promote resilience. Next slide. Being an educational vehicle is also important because there's a tremendous shortage of child and adolescent psychiatrists everywhere. And we have the luxury, being in a big city, to have more resources than many. But even if we look at the state of Massachusetts in totality, still there's a poverty of resources throughout most of the state. And you can kind of see in the background how the map is grayed out, but this is the way pretty much all of America looks in terms of child and adolescent psychiatry resources. And so to be able to get education and to get information and some guidance online is really important for a lot of people who don't have direct access to mental health providers. Next slide. Before the pandemic, there was a lot to worry about. Kids and adults were both stressed. And so then we bring on some of the, and stress is important for us to talk about. Next slide, because it has consequences on our body. If we think about stress, next, you have to, if you think about what happens to you when you're stressed, you tend to have changes in your sleep patterns. You tend to notice that your relationships are more unhealthy or more strained than they usually are. There are emotional problems that come about being overwhelmed and stressed. Your nutrition is poor when you're stressed often. We find ourselves engaging in poor and unhealthy eating habits. And often when people are stressed, they engage in substance use and misuse. And there's so many other unhealthy lifestyle issues that come about by being stressed. It takes a tremendous toll on our body. This is why it's important for us to manage stress and mitigate stress, because ultimately what happens is this vicious cycle where we're stressed and then all of these things happen, which in the end makes us more stressed. And so it's kind of a merry-go-round, round and round it goes. But then we fast forward to next slide, 2019, 2020, 2021, and we find ourselves in this perfect storm of many different crises at once. We have the pandemic, which basically sent us into a screeching halt in terms of just how we are living our day-to-day lives. There was the reckoning on race and the polarization of the nation, and so many other things. There were the natural disasters with the wildfire and hurricanes, and it just kind of continued. Next slide. And the cumulative effect began to mount for many kids and caregivers. And it was unrelenting. The stress of it all was unrelenting. And due to the pandemic, people were home because they had nowhere else that they could go. And they were watching. So everybody was watching, everybody was listening, and everybody was talking about it. And so adults, as well as kids alike, were all aware of what was going on. Even young kids and older kids alike had a lot of awareness about what was going on around them, which created a lot of stress. Next slide. This took a tremendous emotional toll on a lot of our kids. So there was a lot of grief and loss, which we'll come back to. Kids were feeling angry, they were afraid. There was a lot of anxiety and depression that we saw, and there was a tremendous amount of uncertainty. Uncertainty about the future, uncertainty about, how the pandemic would either continue or fade away and how this would impact their life. Kids were worried about standardized testing and college applications, things that people maybe took for granted before, as to whether I should take a gap year or whether I should go straight into the workforce. Do I need to actually take off to work because maybe my family needs my resources or help with some of with income? And so there was a tremendous toll taken on the entire family system, but kids in particular had an emotional toll that was grounded in what is typically natural transitions as kids develop and they grow. Next slide. So just to spend a little bit more time on grief and loss as it relates to kids and adolescents, the biggest thing that we can think about is school. So kids lost school for quite some time. School served as the place where kids had structure, they had routine. And school was a lot more for a lot of kids, was more than just academics. School was a place where they had their social connections and their social interactions. School was a place where obviously they got their education and academics, but for many kids, it was a place where they got 2 of their meals that they could count on. This was also a place where some kids got their treatment. So whether they had a school psychologist or a school counselor that they saw to get their therapy, this is where they relied on those services to get their supports. A lot of kids relied on the resources that were provided by schools, such as computers and books and internet. A lot of homes didn't have internet, which made it hard for them to engage in the remote learning. And then for some kids, they really struggled with the loss of being able to transition into high school as they had imagined it, into this new school. Kids who were going off to college struggled with the idea that they weren't able to transition to college and onto a college campus as they had imagined and dreamed about. So there were a lot of these highly anticipated milestones that they just weren't allowed to take part in, and they really felt like tremendous losses to a lot of kids. Next slide. As we think about it, we also have to think about how the adults were doing. And so again, no one was spared, and this didn't take an emotional toll just on the kids. So let's take just a moment to look at how the pandemic impacted adults. And this is really important for adults and caregivers because our kids cue off of us. So if we're anxious, they feel our anxiety and they become anxious. So it's really important as we think about the toll that it took on adults to remember that we have to be well in order to be the best that we can be to take care of our kids. So this is just that old adage of making sure that you put on your oxygen mask before you help others. And this was really hard because the whole entire family system was stressed. Next slide. Adults were experiencing increased in tension. They were feeling on edge and snappy. they were reporting increasing in mood swings, and then they were finding that they were yelling and screaming at their loved ones more than they would like to. So everyone was just on edge. And then with that, next slide, it became time to think about going back to school. And so while many kids enjoyed going back to school and school was something they look forward to, there were also many kids who struggled with going back to school. However, by far and large, whether it was hard or easy, most kids were looking forward to returning to school. Some kids did it seamlessly, and some kids, for many, the transition was very difficult. Next slide. Specifically with respect to returning to school, there were some challenges that were specific, obviously, to the pandemic. If we think about that our kids were in some sort of isolation or remote setting for almost 18 months, and then fast forward, now it's time for them to return to school full time, this was not something easy to even conceptualize for kids, let alone do. Most of them had the fantasy that going back to school everything would be as normal. And so as parents, we had to help them manage their expectation that school may not look like it did when you left 18 months ago. For kids who appreciated the decrease in social and academic expectations, thinking about going back to school was difficult. Kids who had social anxiety or who struggled being around crowds, they appreciated being home where it was just them and their parents, where they could get reassurance and feel comforted and protected. And kids who struggled academically, whether they had learning disabilities or maybe they had ADHD, school was hard. And so the academic expectations, especially over the remote, was a lot less. And so those kids also flourished at home because, again, the demands were decreased. They had been off their schedules and routines. So thinking about having to return to getting up, having breakfast, putting on clothes so that you actually look presentable to leave the house, and then having to commute to wherever your school is a dramatic shift from rolling over. Maybe you look presentable, maybe you don't, because you're not going to turn your camera on anyway. It caused major problems in a lot of homes. This was a prolonged period, which we'll come back to as well. And then the uncertainty of it all in terms of how is the school going to keep me safe, created a lot of stress for a lot of kids. Next slide. Specifically in terms of COVID, a lot of kids were transitioning either from middle school to high school or from elementary to middle school. And so these kids were going into school sight unseen, which was difficult for them as well. Kids who had been remote and maybe they had some learning challenges didn't get the supports that they needed due to the fact that it was just difficult to deliver those things remotely. They struggled and they worried about whether they were going to be able to keep up. And then we have to think about the great disparity that existed between a lot of kids who did not have access to some of those resources that we talked about, the internet. They didn't have books. Maybe they didn't have parents in the home or caregivers in the home who were fluent in the language or who were able to help them with the homework. And so those kids were kind of left to their own devices to navigate schooling. And I have a couple of degrees, and navigating schooling was difficult for me. Like, I don't know how they have decided to do math these days, but it doesn't remind me of any of the math that I've ever done over the course of my career. So I can imagine, not having some of the basic resources and trying to facilitate schooling for your kids. I can't imagine how difficult that was. Next slide. So loneliness already existed and was on the rise, and with the pandemic, it was exacerbated. And there were some pretty significant consequences for kids feeling lonely. There was emotional fallout. They struggled with sleep and sleep deprivation. They had trouble regulating their emotions and their behavior. We saw a lot of excessive use, so excessive eating, excessive substance use and abuse, all in the effort to self-soothe what they were feeling was pain, which felt unbearable. And there were a lot of medical problems. And so this might look a little familiar to you because I just showed a slide not that long ago that looked at stress. And this looks a lot like stress. Loneliness was stressful. And so it also has similar, effects on our body as stress does. Next slide. And so loneliness increases, they saw increase in suicidal thinking, and just thinking about suicide was also already on the rise. It's the 10th leading cause of death overall and the second leading cause of death among children. And this is a concerning number. Second leading cause of death for people between the ages of 10 and 24. And with the information that is not here, but typically child suicides are typically mislabeled or miscategorized as either unintentional or accidental injuries. So this number is probably even is falsely low. So that this is also a concern in terms of how do we think about suicide and how do we protect kids. Next slide. Suicide is not straightforward. There's a lot of speculation as to why it's on the rise, but we can all agree that it's multifactorial. There are many layers as to what leads a kid to thinking about suicide and what kind of leads a kid to having suicidal thoughts. Next slide. The pandemic had a significant impact on so many. This was because the stress was unrelenting at times and probably at most times for a lot of people. And so many of our outlets that we use to kind of take care of ourselves and to kind of regroup and recharge were taken away from us. Next slide. Earth was essentially closed. There was nowhere that you could go, and which was huge because if we think about some of the things that help us stay grounded and the things that help us feel fulfilled is connection and connection to people and connection to family. And we were not allowed or not able to visit family and friends for quite some time. Next slide. We were not able to have dinner with our friends and families. Gyms were closed. So for some, that's a source of stress relief. Couldn't go to concerts and shows. And then you also weren't able to go to the movies. And again, these were outlets that many people found to be things that brought them joy and pleasure. So next slide. The family system entirely was stressed. We saw an increase, a significant increase in children coming to our emergency rooms to seek support due to depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, self-injury, and more than 40,000 children were lost parents to COVID, which is a tremendous number. Next slide. And if all this wasn't enough, then you had college kids coming home, live back at home. First of all, they didn't want to be back home. They wanted to be at school with their friends. For that age group in particular, connection, peer relationships is extremely important. Peers matter more at that stage of life than parents do. So they didn't want to be there. And then we had to navigate, how do we balance this kid who's independent, but not really they're dependent, but they're independent. They've been away at school. They haven't had you to supervise them or manage their schedules. And now they're coming back home, living under your roof. And how do you navigate and manage, house rules, being safe in COVID, helping them to find space and time to do their online schooling while you're doing your online work. And maybe if there are other kids, they're doing online schooling. It really was a significant source of tension and conflict for a lot of families until they figured out how to find the balance. So this was another stressor that families had to endure in COVID. Next slide. What was also seen on the other side of this in terms of the upside, a lot of people felt that there were lessons to be learned for humanity. And so, next slide. There were silver linings to COVID. And I think a lot of people have talked about some of the silver linings, but specifically, I think as it relates to kids and families, there was a recalibration. So people began to realize or think about, are we overscheduled? Are we doing too many things? Are we trying to be in too many places? And are we enjoying the things that we're doing? So there was a reconsideration of what the priorities are, what the values are, what our lifestyle is, what we want it to look like, and what brings us joy and what brings us pleasure. And so that felt really good for a lot of families to be able to have the time to sit down and just think about those things that they hadn't really been able to give consideration to before. Next slide. Also in COVID, we learned the importance of self-care. Again, going back to the balance and being able to be deliberate about taking care of ourselves, really seeing self-care as something that is a necessity as opposed to a luxury. Next slide. We learned the importance of having fun, making sure that we take breaks. We learned how to be creative and figure out creative ways to have fun and spend time together. And we were able to figure out how to spend time together and be mindful about it and be present, as opposed to spending time together, but we're on our phones and maybe the TV's playing in the background. A lot of families learned how to really be with each other again and be mindful and be in the moment with one another. Next slide. We also learned the importance of resiliency. And this has been talked about, but I think in the pandemic, it's been talked about more and more, and a lot of emphasis has been placed on resiliency and how do we be resilient. And so resilience is essentially defined as the process of adapting while maintaining personal and social stability in the face of adversity. Next slide. Resilience is really, we think about it as a process, more like a muscle. It's not a trait. It's something that we do have to work at, and it's something that we do have to make strong and maintain. But it serves two functions, really. It serves to help us cope in adversity, but it also serves to prevent us from having negative effects. It protects us from adversity as well. And so when we think about resilience, there are many key ingredients, but there are many ingredients and components to resilience. But some of the key elements that we think about when we think about resilience is connection, awareness, wellness, healthy thinking, and meaning. And so we've talked about a couple of times, pointed out where connection was lost. And this is what we had to be creative in figuring out how to make connections, sustain connections, and as parents, facilitate connections for our kids. Next slide. We learned how to foster resilience in our kids. So how do we model being resilient? Again, facilitating these connections. We taught kids and we modeled for them how to take care of themselves. We modeled and taught them how to have coping skills, things that they can do when they're feeling stressed, overwhelmed. We took opportunities to have them be problem-solving partners with us, allowing them to make mistakes as we go through the process together. We learned the importance of maybe thinking about asking questions using how instead of why, and teaching them how to label their emotions. Those are all important things that we learned in terms of how do we foster resilience in our children. Next slide. We also learned that our kids had lots of questions. They had a lot to say, and they wanted to know, were they safe? Were the people caring for them safe? Were we safe? And how was this going to affect their life? And so we learned, next slide, how to have these difficult conversations with our kids. Next slide. Many of us felt kind of helpless at times. Sometimes we maybe felt powerless in terms of how we can best support our kids. We didn't know how sometimes based on the situation to support our youngsters. So we wanted to know as caregivers, what can we do? How can we support our young people? Next slide. So we want to know, what do we look for? When should we worry? What is this normal adolescence? Is this normal development for someone who's 6? What's normal and what's not normal? And then what do we do? What do we do with this information? Next slide. So we learned some of the things that we need to look for. What are we looking for in terms of in our children? We're looking for change. We're looking for changes in behaviors. Do they look different? Is this a kid who used to maybe get up, get dressed, put on clothes, put on makeup, and now they're not? Are they declining academically, whereas maybe they were an A/B student, now they're struggling to get C's and D's? Are they no longer interested in being with their friends and being social? Do they no longer enjoy doing some of the things they used to do? So maybe they used to read, or maybe they used to like to watch a certain show, and now they no longer enjoy those things. Changes in behavior is really important to look for. We also look for changes in things such as sleep and appetite, changes in some of the things that they talk about. They may be talking about things that they're more talking about their fears and worries more than they usually do. So changes in who they are at baseline. Next slide. And we also kind of want to be clear about when we need to start to worry. You can be triggered to think that maybe things have crossed over the threshold and maybe there should be more concern when things are prolonged. So prolonged period of depression. Maybe your child is isolating and withdrawing. They're not, again, wanting to be around the family. They don't want to come to the table for dinner. They don't want to be around their friends. Signs of suffering, behavioral concerns. A 2-year-old falling out in the candy aisle is okay, but maybe 10-year-old falling out in the candy aisle is not okay. So really extreme and excessive changes in behaviors and outbursts and tantrums is something to be worried about. If your kid is engaging in unsafe or risky behaviors, any safety concerns is something to really trigger significant concern and time to worry. If you have concerns that your child is unsafe, and you have to give them your undivided attention and all of your time in order for them to be safe, that's not a safe situation. And so when there's a concern or issues of safety, then this is a time to worry. Next slide. And so now that you have gotten all worked up and you're worried, you need to know what to do. So we want to know as caregivers, what are some actions that we need to take to be able to keep our kids safe and support our children? We always say, and we really try to encourage conversations. We want people to normalize talking to their kids about mental health. So talking to them about, how they're doing, how they're feeling, making those dialogues normal and routine so that they don't feel like they're coming out of always because I'm in trouble or maybe because you're concerned. These are things that we can talk about more freely. You also want to talk to others about your kids. Thinking about talking to teachers and coaches and maybe clergy if they're engaged in the spiritual place that you worship. These people see kids through a different lens. They're able to see them, especially when we think about teachers and coaches, they spend a lot of time at school. They're able to talk to you about how they engage with others. They're able to talk to you about their functioning in terms of their work and their performance. They're able to talk to you about their moods throughout the day. So they can provide a lot of information, insight as to how your child is doing for a large portion of the day because they spend so much time together. And then if this is not sufficient and you're still worried, you want to seek support and guidance. So there are lots of online resources, such as the Clay Center. We have, again, we really want to feel like provide a place where people know they can come and get reliable and safe information regarding taking care of their children and mental health. We don't provide clinical care, but sometimes you just need more information. There are other online resources such as NAMI or the our National Organization for Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. We really encourage families to seek help from their primary care provider. We really do see the primary care provider as the gatekeeper. Again, there's a poverty of resources for children as it relates to mental health, and the primary care provider typically can really help manage a lot of these crises. And then if you have access, seek help from a mental health provider to give you guidance, to help you understand what's going on with your child and to give you ways in which you can best support them. Next slide. So we don't want anyone to worry alone. And as you can see, this is my new favorite show. And next slide. And this is important because we are pack animals. We're used to being together in a group. And so we can all use a helping hand at some time or another. And so we just really want to make sure that there are just some basic information that we're able to provide to you with respect to children and adolescents, some of the struggles, but really most importantly, how you can best support them. So that really is all I had. The next couple of slides are really just resources that we have here at the Clay Center. We included our website, our YouTube page. We do have some really nice videos that are done by kids that I think really resonate with other kids because they're kids that kind of look like them, similar age, to help them think about, again, self-care, which is so important. And I think that's really about it. We really wanted to make sure that we left enough time to have a dialogue, a fruitful discussion about how we can help you help your children.
Well, thank you so much, Khadijah. Michelle, if you want to take down the slides, there we go, and we can all see each other. What a really fascinating talk and sobering, I think. I wanted to mention in the Q&A here, we also have Deirdre Phillips. You want to raise your hand there, Dee Dee, who is the Managing Director of the Clay Center, and also is here to respond if we have any questions. So if you have a question, if you just want to put it in the chat, and I will either call on you, or you can also, in the participant area at the bottom of your screen, you can raise your hand and I will also call on you. But in the meantime, Khadijah, if I could ask you, so with the losses that the children have suffered that you describe, what is your point of view about them catching up? How are they going to catch up? And are they going to catch up? Or are we going to see, you know, a kind of a generation of problems from this particular situation we've been in? Oh, you're on mute, Khadijah. There you
Sorry.
go.
So there were a lot of losses, but what we mostly saw is that there were mostly delays. Kids are going to continue to develop. You know, they weren't in school, so they weren't getting the education, but it's not going to prevent them from learning it. So they will catch up for sure. I think what we really want to focus on is, you know, we hadn't seen a pandemic in over 100 years. So we didn't have a roadmap of, you know, so we've done this before, this is what we're going to do for this one in terms of how we talk to our kids and engage with our kids. I think, again, the takeaway is really helping them to be resilient and flexible so that they can bounce back. And that really is what we're trying to promote with when we engage with families and caregivers, when we see kids in the clinic, when we talk to kids in the school, is really thinking about how we can help kids be resilient. They will catch up. You know, they won't become kids who are unable to be social because they missed a year of socializing. There may be a delay, but they'll catch up.
Yeah, that's heartening. There was some press over the weekend about the difficulty in finding a therapist, and we know that mental health practitioners are in short supply right now. I think you mentioned that in your talk. Can you talk a little bit about what happens? You know, if a parent sees these behaviors you described, takes their child to their primary care, and the primary care practitioner says they're going to need to have more advanced care. What happens next if they can't find a therapist, and are therapists available?
It depends what we're talking about with respect to care. So if they go to their primary care provider and the primary care provider thinks they need to start a medication, but maybe doesn't feel comfortable managing, they could kind of serve as a bridge until they get connected with the mental health provider. You know, our primary care provider can't provide weekly therapy. Their workflow and their schedule is not set up as such. So then we have to think about what are the resources. Unfortunately, there are very limited resources for people who depend on insurance or, you know, don't have insurance. So it's a matter of being creative. So, you know, a lot of pediatricians tend to have a list of people who are taking patients or clinics who are taking patients. That if they're connected to a hospital, you know, that usually is easier, but it doesn't take away from the fact that there's often a wait list, which is why, you know, these online resources, again, not to provide clinical care, but to be able to give people guidance so that they know, you know, what exactly they're looking at, what exactly maybe they can do at home to be supportive and to help their children is so important. But outside of that, you know, we have to think about where else can we think about getting services for kids. School, for some people, is a place where they can get services. Other online resources that maybe provide referrals would be things like NAMI. They often can help with thinking about connection, but the issue really is going to be of resources, and sometimes it comes down to, typically it's easier to find someone who's privately practicing, which again really does not help most people who can't really afford typically out of network or out of pocket providers.
So we're getting some really good questions. Thank you in the chat. Let's first go to a question from Megan Schaefer, who asks, what are the key things that adults can focus on now to help support children beyond academics, specifically to support their social emotional well-being?
So that would be some of those things that we talked about in that the slide around resilience. So helping them to be able to identify their emotions. Again, I think it really starts with like laying the foundation of being able to talk about these things. This is really important as we try to get rid of the stigma around mental health and mental illness. So having regular conversations about how are you feeling? Like, how was school today? Is there anything that you've been particularly worried about? You look sad. Let's talk about like what has happened, or has anything happened to make you sad? So having just regular conversations allows that dialogue to happen, and it also creates a platform for kids to feel comfortable coming to you without being asked to have these conversations. They feel that you can be supportive. They feel that you understand. And when we think about having conversations, we want to make sure that we try to keep it light and follow their lead. you know, sometimes, especially younger kids, some of their fears and worries can seem quite outlandish. And so we have to be mindful as adults to manage our body language, our facial expressions, so that they don't feel judged or criticized. But we want to be honest. We want to say when we don't know things that we don't know, and they just mostly want to know that we're doing all that we can to keep them safe. So it would start with really having conversations with your kids. Other things that you can do is really, you know, do things with them, engage in self-care activities with them. I find it, and most people find it so much easier to do things when you do it together, as opposed to kind of setting up a schedule for them to work out and to do yoga. If you do it together, it becomes another place where you can kind of have conversations, but also you being able to model the importance of these activities. We talk a lot about helping kids kind of connect with nature is a really big thing that helps give kids peace and grounds them, builds resilience, and then making sure that they're connected, with friends and family. You know, if there's a trusted adult around that they feel comfortable and close to, really just fostering these connections that they have, because connection is really one of the keys to really promoting health and resilience.
Thank you, Khadijah. Claire Shaw has asked, what are the options for multilingual and multicultural therapists in the area that would really make a difference with the connection to the child, to a young person?
So that is one of the failures of mental health. There are not enough therapists and providers of diverse cultural backgrounds with being able to speak multiple languages, which makes it hard to overcome the stigma piece. People and kids, as well as adults, want to feel connected, and often when the language is not spoken, it doesn't really make a big difference for the kids often, because the kids are often English speakers. It really makes it difficult to navigate and incorporate the parents in the treatment. And kids don't live on an island unto themselves. So not being able to work with the parents and engage the parents is really a disservice to the treatment as a whole. So we have some of our stuff kind of translated into Spanish. There are some clinics that I would have to look to see where the places are that have multilingual providers. They're not that many.
Yeah, and that would really impact some of the children that are most severely affected by the pandemic. Deb Jolson has asked Khadijah, has telehealth helped expand access to mental health support for kids, or educational support? Telehealth would be meant health support.
So the virtual space that we're in has definitely served to really increase access for kids who wouldn't ordinarily have access. Telehealth is not new. It's just new for us in big cities, but telehealth has been around for a long time in places where they're never going to fill the shortage. People are never going to move in droves to Wyoming or Nebraska. You know, so telehealth has always been something that has happened there, but we have found that we are able to really use it in a way that increases access, increases compliance. Families really appreciate not having to commute. It allows us to have more frequent, even if they're shorter visits with kids and families. So it really has done a great service to increasing access to kids. It still hasn't done enough. And it's not a replacement for in-person visits. It did serve a purpose, and I imagine many kids could probably get away with some sort of hybrid of virtual mixed with in-person visits, but there are some kinks still need to be worked out as it relates to telehealth.
Khadijah, I wanted to turn the subject to something that's very dear to our heart. Many of the people on this call are members of the board of the Children's Museum or staff, is the issue of play. And in my remarks at the beginning, we talked a little bit about how play can mitigate toxic stress. It can help with learning, with growth, skills acquisition. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of play in this recovery of children, and about how parents spending quality time with their children playing can really support their mental health?
Yeah, play is important for kids. This is how they learn how to engage. Another way that they learn how to engage with one another, how they learn how to work collaboratively with other people. Play allows them to just relax without an agenda of being perfect. It allows them to access the other side of their brain where they can be creative, And kids want to spend time with their parents. Even the older kids, they want to spend time with their parents, even though they pretend they don't. And so really engaging in this quality time with kids that they know that they can look forward to really helps manage some of the stress and helps manage some of the anxiety. In part, sometimes kids are not sure when they're going to get time with their parents, because parents, many parents who are working from home, they found their workload to increase as well. And so whereas they maybe had more time before, it became harder and harder. So similar to with self-care, we've talked a lot about being deliberate about spending time with your kids, spending quality time without an agenda, doing something that you enjoy, thinking about a menu of options, depending on how big or small your family is. You may not find things that you agree on. So really together as a family, coming up with like a menu of things that you guys can do or want to do together, so that you guys can engage in activities and play together. Play is important. It's important for kids to have parents do things that they like, to be able to show that I'm interested and I'm open to what you're interested in. So there are lots of important components that play allows for parents to have with their kids.
Thank you. We do have a question from Sonia Kurzweil, who's a psychologist that works with kids, who's asked us, what else can we do at Boston Children's Museum to help promote mental health and resiliency in young children beyond what you heard that we are doing?
That's a good question. I think there are so many things that so many of us can do. Providing resources to give education, I think is a big thing that you can do at the museum.
Well, just providing the opportunity for children to play with their parents. What's kind of unique about the Children's Museum is that we're unlike a school. We actually have the parents together, and modeling play activities is one of the ways that we help them. But as you're thinking about that, Khadijah, can I just turn quickly to you, Dee Dee? We haven't heard from you at all. Before we go, can you just say a few more words about the Clay Center and how people can access what you do and how we can take advantage of all the resources that you have?
Sure. You probably saw at the end of Khadijah's presentation our website, which is mghclaycenter.org, and you will find there a wide array of resources in a multimedia format. So there will be articles and videos and presentations and a podcast on any number of sort of the regular mental health issues that we've talked about today, but also some of the social and societal ones that there's not so much available on, like bullying or sadly shootings and all kinds of issues that come up for kids that really scare them and that are hard to talk about. So one of the pieces we try to put into every article is how to start a conversation around that topic. And they're usually broken out by age. So those are all available on our website. It is a free multimedia platform. So please use it. Please pass it on to others. One thing the museum could do is share those resources with your partners, with your board. Most of us are families one way or another. We all know people who need these resources. So pass it along, and it's there because it's needed, and it can start this process. So
yeah, I guess to the point of the conversation starter. So we always talk about having conversations, and often people are like, well, what does that look like? And so I think going back to the play, I think especially for people with younger kids, they may not exactly know how to play with their kids. They may not have had parents who played with them. So again, with an older kid, you could sit down and talk and you can follow their lead. With a younger kid, you might have to be more, take charge of kind of directing a little bit of the play or creating a space for play. And so helping them with ideas of how to play and engage with their kid could be really helpful. Because we talk about it and it seems for some natural, but for many, it's not. I mean, so just being mindful of those differences is important.
And we do have a lot of resources for how parents can play with their kids at home. And Dee Dee and Khadijah, what we'll also do is when we post the recording, we can actually post resources. Was someone else going to say something?
Got a hand up.
Oh,
Yeah.
a hand up. I've got, oh, there's Connie Counts with her hand
Hi.
up, our dear
just-
friend.
I just want to offer two other resources that I found very helpful. And they are the Center for the Developing Child at Harvard with the wonderful work of Jack Schoenkoff. And secondarily, a program at the Harvard Ed School called Making Caring Common, which is also very important in helping teachers to kind of moderate their work with kids to help them cope better with the stress that the pandemic has created. But finally, I wanted to say thank you for doing this wonderful program, and you know, let's all help our kids as much as we can. So.
Well, I couldn't have said that better myself, Connie. Let me just ask if Khadijah, if you had any last words.
I don't. I just would say thank you for having us, and we don't want anyone to worry alone. So if you have questions, we are here, and we have we'll share the website and the links. Again, we provide a lot of useful information and guidance that I think people can find helpful, because it's often scary and we don't often know what is something we should worry about and what is something that is just kind of part of the normal progression of development.
Thank you so much. Dee Dee, did you have any last words?
I would just say that if anyone on this call has topics that they think would be particularly important to address that we haven't talked about, we're always interested in those kinds of nuances, and we want to make sure we're being responsive to all who use our resources and who are concerned about kids. So that would be helpful.
Well, thank you both so very, very much. But such an important topic, so beautifully articulated. And we had many, many people on the call that are from all across the city who I know are going to benefit from your wisdom. And again, we will post all of this information on our website. So again, I just want to say for the trustees, you know, this will be followed by our business meeting. So you do need to log out and then log back on with the other Zoom that was a link that was sent to you. But I want to thank everyone for attending this really interesting talk today, and especially our two guests, Dr. Khadijah Booth Watkins and Dee Dee Phillips from the Clay Center at Mass General Hospital. Thank you all, and may the kids all recover, as will we.
Thank you, Carol.
Take care.
Thank you.